Hi, everyone. Welcome to Interchange. I'm Dan Jones. Thank you so very much for joining us. Great stuff to talk about again today. Governor Walker now says there's no deadline at all for his decision on the Kenosha casino. We'll wonder why it is taking so long. Walker also won't say whether he'll sign into law the measure which will make it much, much easier for schools to keep their Indian nicknames for the athletic teams. We'll talk about Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett's claim that more than half of the city employees will move out of Milwaukee if they are allowed to. And we'll talk about whether Green Bay Packer fans should throw in the towel now that we've lost Aaron Rodgers. Let me introduce everybody. You know Joel McNally, longtime newspaper columnist. Kevin Fischer, former broadcast journalist, political analyst. Denise Callaway, communications and public relations professional. And Gerard Randall, education consultant, local job creation expert. Rick Horowitz is going to be along with commentary at the end of the show. Okay, first thing, Governor Walker keeps missing his own self-imposed deadlines for a decision on whether or not to allow the Menominee tribe to build a huge casino in Kenosha. Today, he said there is no longer a deadline. He's going to take his time to get it done right. He also says he's hoping for a creative solution. Kevin, what do you think that means?
I don't know. I wish I had some inside information, but if he says there might be a creative solution, I bet there's something in the works. In the world of punditry, sometimes we overanalyze, and I think this is one of those cases. He says he's taking more time because he wants to examine everything that's out there or in there, and I think that's exactly what is happening. Politics is the art of compromise. It's my guess that in this case, a solution is being worked out where everybody comes out somewhat of a winner. They don't all get what they want, but at least they walk away from the negotiating table not as upset or as angry as they may have been weeks and weeks ago.
Denise, now some cynics are saying, well, he just wants to wait as long as possible because he didn't get money from each side.
Well, I suppose that could be the case, but I think it's also a matter of he's trying to figure out how to make this work. And the problem is he had determined, this was his call, that all the other tribes had to agree. Every tribe had to agree in order to be able to allow for this expansion in Kenosha. And I think he's trying to figure out a way to get those other tribes to be able to agree. You know, kind of lost in all of this, I think really is the question about whether or not we need another casino in Wisconsin. And I just think that we don't. You know, we don't need another casino in Wisconsin. It is, and quite frankly, it may not seem like it to the governor right now, but it is a relatively easy way to be able to have a lot of jobs come into the state in a rather short period of time. And I'm sure that's one of the things he's thinking about because we're not anywhere close to the 250,000 jobs that he talked about. I think he's trying to figure out a way to make this work so we can bring those jobs in here. But I think to me the bigger question that we really just kind of seem to be glossing over is whether or not we honestly need to have another casino in the state. And I, for one, don't think we do.
Some people think that he wants to approve it, but he doesn't want to tick off the Potawatomi because they've been very good to Milwaukee, even when he was county executive in Milwaukee.
Well, I think in the whole political equation, you have to look at how many votes will he get out of southeastern Wisconsin, first looking at the Racine-Kenosha community and then looking at the Milwaukee community. And Milwaukee has certainly benefited from the generosity of the Potawatomi tribe. And part of the reason is because when the tribe got the casino, it got money dedicated to both the city of Milwaukee and to Milwaukee County, which no one has seemed to talk about as part of the deal if a Kenosha casino would be put in place. The other piece to this, though, and I agree with you, Denise, we've got enough casinos. And I think the governor believes that also, that we've got enough gaming. I don't think he's a big fan of gaming. Regardless of the time frame in all of this, he's got to tamp down some of the strong criticism that he's facing from radio talk show host Mark Belling, who keeps pushing this thing as a jobs initiative. And I don't know that the governor ever anticipated that he would have to address that part of the world when he was making his decision. So I think if he allows for a little bit more time to take place between now and the time he makes this decision, maybe this conversation will die off a little bit, and that will give him an opportunity to decide what I think he's going to decide.
Obviously is the major piece here, but another factor is the state's take on gaming. I mean, the gaming is, that genie is out of the bottle and it's here to stay. Whether it gets expanded or not, no, that's to be decided. But it's well documented that the state of Wisconsin, compared to other states, does not get as big a percentage cut in revenue from tribal casinos, and i.e. New Jersey and others. So that might be one of the underlying reasons why the governor wants to take a little longer here, because if you're going to have this expansion of gaming, then the state is going to need a bigger piece of the pie.
If we let the Potawatomi tribe have money from gambling, and the Ho-Chunk tribe and the Oneida tribe, is it fair then to say to the Menominee tribe, nope, you can't have it?
Well, there's got to be a limit somewhere, and there's got to be an end somewhere. I'm just amazed at this polite conversation about gambling, which is what it is, gambling, not gaming. They don't play Parcheesi, they gamble. And, we've had this whole conversation, and no one has mentioned corruption, which is right in the center of this debate. When Scott Walker said a couple weeks ago, I'm going to make a decision in a couple weeks, and they have to meet these criteria, 2 criteria that were impossible to meet, that all the tribes had to agree, because we know that there are 2 tribes that have casinos that weren't going to agree, and that no new net gambling be created in Wisconsin. You add a $800 million casino, there's going to be some new net gambling in Wisconsin. And if he had any integrity, he would have lived up to those criteria. But clearly, the closer he got to when he claimed he was going to make the decision, I did write a column 2 weeks ago saying that he would not make the decision by his deadline, that he would extend it as long as possible, because the longer he extends it, it's a money gusher for his political campaign. Both sides will be throwing money at his political campaign. And I would have had a little respect for him had he made a decision based on his criteria. But I'm not going to have any respect for him extending it out as far as possible to grab as much money as he can possibly grab from all sides. That is corruption. There's been corruption around this Kenosha casino from the beginning. People have gone to prison. A county executive, was convicted. And all he is doing is dirtying the reputation of Wisconsin, dirtying the reputation of Wisconsin politics, and you can't not say that, because you can't pretend like he's staying up nights weighing, how am I going to make this decision to meet my criteria, since clearly it won't. And I don't know how long it's going to take, but my guess is it's going to take as long as he can grab as much money as he can grab.
All right, next topic. Also sitting on Walker's desk is a bill approved by both houses of the state legislature, which makes it much, much easier for schools to use Indian nicknames for their athletic teams. Is this a given that he just quietly signs it into law, or, Denise, do you think he's going to surprise people on this?
My surprise would be that he didn't sign it. I think he's going to sign it, and I think it's a real shame. We've talked about this issue a number of different times, and it never ceases to amaze me how people are so willing to tell folks who are the subject of these nicknames that they don't have any right to be offended by the nicknames because they're meant to honor them. We see this play out on a national stage now with the Washington football team. I will not use their nickname, and how it has just absolutely polarized people. But the one people who are absolutely certain that it's a bad thing to do to have these derogatory nicknames as it relates to Native Americans are Native Americans. And I think what we have to do, if we are a state whose motto is in fact forward, if we are a state that has always been known as progressive, it baffles me as to why we would allow these nicknames that are certainly insensitive. In some cases, I believe when you take the nicknames and marry them to the caricatures they have, their logos, they're not just racially insensitive. Some of them, I think, are racist in the way that they portray Native Americans. I don't know when we decided in Wisconsin it was okay to do that. I guess I must have been sleeping then.
Kevin, the Washington Redskins didn't back down, and
Ooh, you said Redskins.
and the supporters of the McQuantico Indians don't seem to be backing down either.
No, because they consider this part of their long, proud legacy and history, and they did not choose these names because they were names to be ridiculed and to make people feel offended and to be insensitive. They chose these nicknames and mascots because they considered them symbols of strength. Now, I'm not going to repeat some of the things that I've said about this legislation on previous shows. I think the legislation is fair. It's a matter of due process, the process that is in place right now, where one person can wake up in the morning, be disgruntled and say, I don't like it, and suddenly the school district is guilty until proven innocent. I think that's wrong. From a political standpoint, you don't bring a bill to the floor of the state Senate or the floor of the state assembly without knowing that you have the votes for it to pass. And the legislative leaders have probably been in discussions with the governor's office, who is now looking over the bill, so that they have some kind of knowledge of which way the governor's wind will blow. So I think he will sign it, and I think it's good. You just can't willy-nilly scream, I'm offended, and which, by the way, like it or not, in America, you don't have the right to not to be offended. This puts in place a fair process for these school districts who now are not guilty until proven innocent. You've got to have some legitimate proof that you're out to be racially insensitive or discriminatory.
I can understand why people would be offended by the Redskins, but can you use that same argument when you have words like Braves or Chiefs or Indians?
Well, but the thing is, they're caricatures, and perhaps when these teams were named, they weren't considered racially offensive. But they certainly are today, and they certainly are to the people that are made into cartoons. But I honestly don't think these school districts, you might be surprised to hear me say this, are racist. I think they're stupid. I think they are racially insensitive not to know that they are offending a group of people racially, and as a matter, but. You know, when they originally, a long time ago, somebody came up with a dumb name. In modern days, it is racially offensive. The Washington Redskins cannot claim that that's not a racially offensive name. And it's not you don't have to lie about it either. You don't have to lie and say, well, we're trying to honor, the Native Americans. That wasn't why teams got these names. They got the names the same way that, teams got names of animals. You weren't trying to honor animals. You made it.
We were the Hayworth Huskies in high school. We were not trying to honor Huskies.
You made up some name for your team, and through the passage of time, people who did not have a voice to say anything about it, Native Americans, who we didn't care what they thought about it, now are registering their complaints. And, it's not one person waking up in the morning and being offended. Native Americans, a large majority of Native Americans are offended by all of these names and the fact that we would caricature them. But I honestly don't think these districts are racist. I think they are just totally opposed to change. It is a conservative attitude that, we cannot change, we don't have to change. And yeah, as a matter of fact, as time passes in society, you do have to become more tolerant, become more racially aware. And change is a good thing.
How about when State Senator Lena Taylor, an African-American, got up the other day and said something like, you can't call me the N-word or call your team the N-word and then tell us not to be offended. Did she have a good point?
Yeah. And I do think that there are some instances where, like with the Washington Redskins, there's going to have to be some change. Florida Seminoles, why should there be change? They work with the tribe. The tribe understands that that team is named after the tribe as a sign of respect. And so you got two very different situations that you need to have sensible people take a look at to say there is a difference here. you've got Indian names that dot the Midwest, that dot the West and the South. And somewhere along the line, I think people are going to have to exercise some rationality to say that there are instances where, as Kevin points out, it really is a sign of respect. It's not a blanket, every name that bears an Indian tribe's name or reference is offensive.
But some of these terms were very offensive as they were being used. The word chief was not used in a way, and when many people were talking to Native American men in ways that were meant to be respectful. It was derogatory.
All right, next topic. The city of Milwaukee went to court to fight a new state law that forbids cities from forcing their public employees to have to live in the city of Milwaukee. Now, Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett says if that law is allowed to take full effect, that more than half of the 7,000 city workers would move out of Milwaukee. What does this say about the attractiveness of the city, Denise, as a place to live?
Well, as someone who lives in the city of Milwaukee and the governmental entity that I work for no longer requires residency. I mean, I choose to live in the city because I find that it's an attractive place to live. And I think the mayor's selling employees of the city just a little short. I really do not believe there will be this mass exodus of people from the city. Are some people going to move? Absolutely. But I just think, when I take a look at people who I know who live in the city and they talk about the neighborhoods where they live, they happen to like where they live. And I think if you like where you live and you have found it to be a place where you feel like you can thrive and grow, you don't all of a sudden decide you're going to leave it because you can one day. So I don't think that many city employees are going to leave. Will some of them leave? Absolutely. But I think the mayor really does a disservice to city workers. And, of course, the comments that I've heard from people are, well, the mayor thinks that many people are going to move. What's he doing then to make the city an attractive place for people to be? So you have to be careful that something like this doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I mean, I was just really kind of surprised to hear someone who's supposed to be the biggest cheerleader for this city talking about the fact that, he would expect people who are employed here, who you would assume love their work and at least like living in this community, that many people would want to leave a residency.
I thought it was kind of an odd timeline to say 60% would move out within 11 years. Well, who knows what's going to happen in 11 years?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some people who may have considered moving out took a look at their economic situation and made the decision that they're going to stay. That typically is one of the primary reasons people make a decision to move or to stay. Another reason would be schools. If you have a young family or people who are on the verge of retirement and they're looking at, maybe converting some of their assets. So all of these things are reasons why people make those decisions. I will say, though, that, and I've said this on this show before, if you look at where municipal employees live, they live primarily in two corners of the city, and so they're poised to move, but that doesn't necessarily mean they will move. I'm one of those critics of the mayor who would say, you need to change the conversation at this point because the law is that people can live where they choose to live and still remain as employees of local governments. And that being said, if you want people to find Milwaukee to be an attractive place, then get on the page that talks about all of the great things about living here that make Milwaukee a sensible and attractive place versus a place that you want to run away from, you don't want to consider working here. Because at the same time, we're talking about how do we get people to come back to this community to work. We certainly want them to come back to take advantage of the amenities that we have here around recreation. And if people have this sense that the city has gone to hell in a handbasket, why come?
Is it time for Barrett to shift gears and just give in?
No, I mean, they're fighting it legally because they are fighting it legally. I mean, they've always been opposed, and they, in the contract negotiations, would try to resist changing this rule, and they're continuing to try to resist. But let me say this on behalf of Tom Barrett. He is right that the city is under attack, that state shared revenue is being gutted, that aid to Milwaukee Public Schools is being gutted, and that is very frightening for people in this city. You don't say, well, make this city better while we give you less and less in the way of resources. Let's start putting some resources into the city to improve the city. If all you're doing is taking away resources from the city, people can use their eyes and say, that means fewer and fewer services, higher and higher costs. It means continuing to cripple the schools. It means continuing to take away services on a municipal level because the state of Wisconsin is right now in the hands, even though the governor is from this area, in the hands of people who have targeted this city and are taking resources away from this city. There are going to be people who would prefer to live in the suburbs than the city. There are also going to be people who prefer to live in the city. I and Denise and others prefer to live in the city. We wouldn't even think about living in the suburbs. But the mayor is putting up the fight. He's putting up the fight to try to maintain something that they won in labor negotiations. So the governor reached in and did the negotiating for everybody else and said, clear out, everybody.
Kevin, I want to give you a chance.
In my line of work, I have occasion many times to see Tom Barrett speak at ribbon cuttings, grand openings, etc., where he speaks very highly of the city of Milwaukee. He needs to continue that drumbeat instead of this, well, my goodness gracious, we're going to become the city of Detroit, which I think
he doesn't say that.
Which is just preposterous. Denise is right. Gerard is right. You have a great city. If you believe in it, then sell it that way. If you believe that people are going to leave like crazy, then give them reasons to stay and be the #1 cheerleader and ambassador for the city you represent.
All right, I promised we'd touch on the Packers, so we only have a minute, so we have to touch on it. No Aaron Rodgers, at least temporarily. Do we throw in the towel, Denise?
Well, maybe I'll throw in the washcloth. I'm not really going to throw in the towel. I mean, it's tough. We're going to have to see what Mike McCarthy is able to do in terms of building a defense around Seneca Wallace. I mean, that's who your quarterback is right now. He's had a week to be able to figure it out. But, it is what it is. I am nervous about what the next few games are going to look like. But, Aaron Rodgers is clearly important, but he's not the only player on the team.
Do we get Matt Flynn?
Well.
We should have thought about this whole quarterback situation back earlier in the year when we had an opportunity to go after some quality backups. And no one ever thought we'd be in this situation that we're in now.
You can win if a Clay Matthews or a Jermichael Finley goes down. You can compete and win. You're talking about your
leader.
The #1 position on the field, an MVP player. When he goes down, you're in big trouble.
But I have to say, yes, we need Aaron Rodgers, but the reason we lost that game last week was the defense. It wasn't the offense. We can put together an offense maybe, but the defense has got to really be what it has shown it can be.
All right. It's not every day that I get to mention Aaron Rodgers and Rick Horowitz in the same sentence.
Not ever.
But this
That's a
is
good
one
day,
of
though,
those.
isn't it?
This is one of those rare times, and there's a perfectly good reason for it. At least that's what Rick says. You can decide for yourself, Rick.
Finally, Aaron Rodgers and I have something in common. Go ahead, guess. MVP award? That's not it. Multi-million-dollar contract? That's not it. Discount double check? Nope. We've both had the same football injury. That's right, a broken collarbone playing football. Okay, so there were a couple of differences. Age, for one. I was in my mid-30s when it happened to me. Rodgers is just a few weeks shy of 30, so there's that. Also, Aaron Rodgers broke his collarbone on a Monday night in front of 78,000 people at Lambeau Field and millions of people watching on ESPN. I broke my collarbone on a Saturday afternoon at a park in Arlington, Virginia, in front of, well, counting everyone on the field, 15 people. And counting everyone watching in the stands and on TV, still 15 people. But it was exactly the same injury, a broken collarbone in my non-throwing shoulder. Actually, I guess both of my shoulders were non-throwing shoulders since I wasn't the quarterback. I was a receiver, a fleet and shifty receiver, at least for a Saturday afternoon pickup game in a park. There were some other differences, too. Rodgers was looking into the end zone trying to complete a pass for a touchdown when he got hurt. I was already in the end zone trying to catch a pass for a touchdown. And Rodgers got his collarbone broken when a linebacker wrapped him up on a scramble and drove him into the ground. I broke my collarbone all by myself. The pass was low and a little wide, and I kind of dove for it, tried to cradle it. That's when I heard the crack. I don't know if Aaron Rodgers heard the crack. It's probably harder to hear a crack in front of 78,000 people, right? Other differences? Well, Aaron Rodgers jogged into the locker room, and then after the second half started, he came out of the locker room to stand on the sidelines. I didn't jog into the locker room, and I didn't come out of the locker room after the second half started. There wasn't any locker room. But if we'd had a locker room, I'm sure I'd have come out of it. I'm not sure about the jogging in part, but the coming out, of course. Maybe not in the second half, but eventually. So anyway, I know exactly what Aaron Rodgers is going through right now, and I'm totally sympathetic. Oh, and I'm totally optimistic too, because that's the other thing we have in common. My broken collarbone had absolutely no effect on my NFL career.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.